Good afternoon and welcome to In Focus with Silvana Pavlovska. For the last few months, we have been broadcasting on this program the Prespa agreement as a cultural genocide of the Macedonian national identity towards the termination of an illegal treaty by eminent Professor Dr. Igor Janev. In our last broadcast, we completed chapter 4, which was a major chapter in this scholarly publication. Today, we are going to start with chapter 5. From the outset, I wish to mention that we have permission from the professor to broadcast this to you and make it known publicly. It is in English. So chapter 5. The title of chapter 5 is Further Destabilization of a State Due to Exception and Endorsement of the Bulgarian Assimilation Policy into the form of the EU Conditions for Membership. I'm going to try and see if I can bring this up. No, we're not able to share that for the time being. Never mind. So chapter 5.1. The new government of the Social Democrats Party, or SDSM, with the same policy towards the Bulgarian demands and undergoing assimilation of Macedonians into Bulgarians. After the fall of Zaev's government in 2021, his political party SDSM remained in power, and Zaev's party deputy leader, Dmitr Kovachevsky, member of the SDSM, became the new prime minister. Kovachevsky assumed the office of the head of government on January the 17th, 2022. After Zaev officially resigned as the president of the SDSM party, Kovachevsky won the internal party elections on the 12th of December 2021 with strong support from Zaev as his mentor. Kovachevsky was sworn as prime minister on the 16th of January 2022. So he wasn't elected. The party selected him, and then he was sworn as the new prime minister. Not as a result of an election, but as a result of a political party choosing him, or Zaev choosing him to replace him. Despite the progressive opposition and repeated demands for the general election by the Macedonian opposition, SDSM remained in power in 2022, a year to be remembered as a total disaster of national policy, particularly against the Bulgarian assimilation attempts. Due to the lack of a proper political education, the new prime minister, Kovachevsky, did not grasp the apparent deficiencies of the so-called French proposal launched in June 2022 for resolving the so-called, in quotes, dispute with Bulgaria, and naively gave support to the plan in order to obtain a date for starting negotiations with the European Union for membership at any cost. That's what they've been telling people. We need a date, we need a date. And there's no date. Most likely there won't be a date. Silvana making a commentary here. Yeah, so in his address to the Macedonian parliament in July 2022, Kovachevsky proved his incompetence, says Professor Igor Janev, and a complete misunderstanding of the political and legal character of the so-called French proposal for the European Union negotiating framework. Quotation. The reason why we are debating is to define the beginning of negotiations with the EU. We accepted the first proposal, and in Brussels, I loudly said no to the first set of ideas. That set was inconsistent with our red lines. That set of ideas did not guarantee the status of the Macedonian language and did not define a clear beginning of negotiations with the European Union. Short and clear, I said no, because it was not good for Macedonia. We were able to get a new proposal that truly reflects our red lines. The Macedonian language is recognized in the EU. The Macedonian language will be spoken everywhere in Europe. Bilateral issues are not part of the negotiating framework with Brussels. And most importantly, the European proposal defines the holding of the first intergovernmental session in Brussels. I, the government and the president of the state said yes to such a proposal. End of quotation. Kovachevsky attempted to say that the first French proposal was unacceptable, but that the revised second version was satisfactory. In fact, as was revealed later to the public, the first French proposal and the second one, the so-called second one, didn't differ at all. There was no difference. The so-called second version of the French proposal was entirely acceptable by the Bulgarian government, and as such, that framework for the EU negotiations with Macedonia was fully endorsed by the Bulgarian parliament with huge majority of the votes that were cast. Bulgarian side openly revealed the truth that there was no second French proposal, thereby denouncing the ordinary lies that were fabricated by the Macedonian government in order to deceive the public and obtain popular and public support for that apparently dubious proposal at any cost. In addition, the actual content of the French proposal remained completely unknown to the public and the political opposition in Macedonia at that time. With respect to that, the requested clarification in Parliament. Quotation, we demand that the information sent by the government be returned to them as incomplete material and that the dignity of the Parliament not be violated with such a document. The sheet of paper that the government calls information on the contents of the proposal for the negotiating framework for negotiations between Macedonia and the EU is an utter disrespect to the members of parliament. It's not possible to discuss the most important work in the country in the next 10 years with one sheet of paper. End of quote. What was discovered in public a bit later was that the French proposal was accompanied with a special protocol between the two governments that in fact incorporated all Bulgarian conditions, and therefore revised version was even worse than the initial original French proposal, allegedly refused by the government. That protocol later to be signed between the Macedonian Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Bulgarian Minister of Foreign Affairs was kept a secret from the members of parliament and the Macedonian public. The Macedonian Daily Republika reports that the parliamentary group requests that the Macedonian-Bulgarian protocol be submitted urgently to the public, which is the most important document in this process. This demand by the Macedonian opposition and the public remained unanswered, and full text of the protocol remained hidden up to the moment of its conclusion. Why so? The protocol was signed and concluded by, not again, Osmani, the Albanian from Kosovo, unfortunately, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of North Macedonia, but sometimes his behavior is one of a minister of whatever affairs of Albania, which is a totally separate foreign country. That's my commentary, by the way. Yeah, so he signed it. Osmani signed it, and so did the Bulgarian Foreign Minister Genocide on Sunday morning, 17th of July, in Bulgaria, far from the eyes of the Macedonian public. Unbelievable. The leader of the VMRO-DPMNE, Mickovski, rejected a disgraceful French proposal, stating that this plan does not offer any beginnings of the European Union integration, but that rather complete blockade in the process of the EU integration. Quotation, in Bulgaria, they rejoice that this proposal contains all the demands, which are extremely unfavorable for Macedonia and tend to deny the Macedonian identity, language, and history. end of quote. And Mickoski and the presidency of his party also observed the creation of a, quotation, dispute on identity embedded in the new EU conditions. Quotation, if the unilateral declaration of Bulgaria is added to this content, which directly denies the uniqueness of the Macedonian language and notes that this is a Bulgarian dialect, it is obvious what position Macedonia is in, which does not have any guarantees from the European Union for the European perspective, end of quote. VMRO and the entire political opposition have spotted and finally understood, have realized and finally understood that the attached unilateral declarations of Bulgaria and Macedonia actually created an artificial dispute on culture this time. They were Bulgarian disgraceful conditions formally transformed as actual EU conditions that need to be met in order to achieve the membership in the EU. I question this. How can you have this so-called dispute on culture alleged by the Bulgarian state and put that through with the European Union as a European Union condition? How can the European Union admit something like that? Did they not read it? Or if they did read it, why did they allow it? It was another condition to be met, a new condition. In more details, these conditions were spelled out in the protocol between Macedonia MFA and Bulgarian MFA, MFA meaning Ministers of Foreign Affairs, that became attached and constituent part of the EU framework standard described as the French proposal or French framework for EU negotiations with the Republic of North Macedonia. As in the case of the Prespa agreement, the Bulgarians demands actually encompass a disgraceful condition for constitutional amendments as a prerequisite for even starting the EU negotiations. These constitutional amendments related to history and culture, as was discovered by the Bulgarians themselves, attempt to clarify that Macedonians have Bulgarian roots. They have Bulgarian roots, and that the Macedonian as such didn't exist. In order to prevent the process of an apparently imposed and therefore forceful assimilation and block the, quotation, mandatory constitutional revisions as EU conditions, the leader of VMRO-d-PMN, Christian Mickoski, requested from his parliamentary group, the MPs and the coalition MPs, to swear not to vote for the constitutional changes requested by Bulgaria, requested or demanded by Bulgaria, I think. With respect to that all VMRO-d-PMN's members of parliament notarized statements that they will not accept any changes in the constitution. The leader of the opposition, Mr. Mickoski, at a press conference stated that, quotation, a total of 44 MPs from VMRO-d-PMN and the coalition as a guarantee to the people have notarized statements that they will not accept a change to the constitution in good conscience, end of quote. And added a view that, quote, this is the completion of the second part of Zaev's betrayal, end of quote. He also added that the, in quote, betrayal will be uneasy conscience that every MP and member of the government who supported this proposal must live with, end of quote. Apparently, constitutional revision now as a European condition, the Bulgarian government requested with a view to establish Bulgarians in the constitution as a constituent nation in this country. By this revision, or rather transformation, all Macedonians could be redefined and reshaped as Bulgarians. Wouldn't that be lovely? That was entirely unacceptable for the vast majority of Macedonians. The majority of ethnic Macedonians rejected to be redefined as Bulgarians, despite the EU promises for better future in EU. Now, well then, EU promising better future if the Bulgarians were included in the constitution as ethnic minorities or groups of people living in Macedonia, of which there are hardly any. What a demand, disguised as a European Union condition. and then, of course, declared by the European Union, because it seems like it was a condition. It seems like it was a condition, Silvana commenting on these statements. This European Union, in fact, contributed to the imposed and forceful assimilation of Macedonians, completely unaware of legal aspects related to assimilation. I would ask, completely unaware or fully unaware? Yes, the journalist in me asking questions. Anyway, I think we should end this section here and now and continue chapter 5 very shortly. For 10 days in June of 2022, the Macedonian population protested against the French proposal until finally the protocol between the two ministers for foreign affairs was endorsed by the parliamentary majority headed by the Social Democrats, that is the SDSM, in a pretty much forced out manner, says Professor Igor Janev. Protests of Macedonian people were at some moments violent, but the huge police presence and decisive, brutal actions forcefully established order around the parliament and other government buildings and institutions. The government headed by SDSM and the Albanian party DUI, as well as the European Union officials on their side, claimed the proposal was a, in quotation, good step forward. Furthermore, they claimed that it is, in quotation, only opportunity. It's the only opportunity, end of quotation, for Macedonia to open such negotiations. At this point, it should be noted that the voting for the French proposal in Parliament was even more dubious, since the documents presented were incomplete. And particularly that was the case with the hidden protocol concluded later between both the ministers for foreign affairs, for which the government launched misperception to this in not a part or annex 2 of the French proposal. At the session, the members of parliament actually voted only for one page short government report or information on the protocol related to the French proposal, with lack of crucial information for the decision-making process. The Macedonian MPs didn't have vital information or even basic knowledge of the alleged differences in the text of the French proposal's revisions and the protocol. In addition, they were uninformed about the content of the unilateral declaration of Bulgaria attached to the protocol, and thus the French proposal. Wow. How can this be so? How can this be so? Unlike in the Macedonian members of parliament, text of the protocol and both unilateral declarations, that is the Macedonian and the Bulgarian, were fully known to the Bulgarian MPs and most of the public there. So in other words, in Bulgaria, the Bulgarian people knew about this. The Bulgarian members of parliament also knew about it, but it was a hidden secret in Macedonia. The Macedonian people didn't know anything about it. The members of parliament didn't know anything about it. Did the Minister of Foreign Affairs know? Did the United States of America know? Did the European Union know? I think you know the answer to that. But they kept it hush-hush. Yes, you can tell on whose side they are, the so-called strategic partners. Unlike the Macedonian members of parliament, the text of the protocol and both unilateral declarations, Macedonian and Bulgarian, were fully known to the Bulgarian members of parliament and most of the public in Bulgaria. Strikingly, on the day when a decision on the French proposal in the Macedonian parliament was scheduled to take place, the president of the European Union, you've seen her, Ursula von der Leyen, visited Skopje, and she invited herself and addressed the parliament. Really? Openly suggesting, urging MPs to vote in favor of the French proposal. How desperate is the European Union to make these changes that are to the detriment of the people of Macedonia and the country we've always known since antiquity as Macedonia. She was in the Macedonian parliament encouraging people to vote, encouraging members of parliament to vote in favor of the French proposal. French proposal being the European proposal. Of course, she supports it. There's no opposition from the United States of America or any other such country. Tells a lot, doesn't it? Similar support, or rather unusual pressure, from the European Union and the USA had been manifested days before a decision in the parliament was delivered. There we go. Professor writes. Furthermore, Macedonian MPs were informed by the government that regardless of their decision in the parliament, the protocol will be signed anyway, and the French proposal will be accepted. This sounds like an ultimatum. Yeah, the only solution, isn't it? The European Union and the United States of America, only solution. It will be signed anyway, and the French proposal would be accepted. So then why vote? Why did Ursula von der Leyen come to Macedonia? Why was she allowed to go into the parliament? Who is she? She's got no standing in Macedonia whatsoever. Maybe not in the European Union either. But anyway, they're stuck with her for the time being. So would be signed anyway, and the French proposal will be accepted, since this course of action was in quote, in exclusive jurisdiction of the executive branch of the government. Really? So even if Parliament failed to give the endorsement, the French proposal will still be accepted and the protocol will be signed regardless of the vote. What a democracy. Therefore, as anyone can conclude with respect to this unusual situation, voting in the Macedonian parliament that took place was only a charade to satisfy the so-called democratic criteria, or to play of democracy. The decision was already made before the voting, and the Macedonian people were deceived, by the government once again, the government and their supporters. During the voting on the information on the protocol, all opposition parties in the Macedonian parliament boycotted the process. They boycotted it. Clearly, a decision to accept the French proposal with the protocol was strikingly against the people's will. Crucial part in that charade played the Speaker of the Parliament, T. Jaferi, an Albanian from Kosovo with a checkered criminal history. This is my commentary, proving once again that he has a special role in the autocratic process related to nullification of the Macedonian nation and division of the Macedonian territory. Ulterior motives. In the document of the European Union so-called proposal published by government, page 3, we found deliberately vague formulation stating that the quotation regarding the translations of the acquis into Macedonian, the European Union took note of Bulgaria and North Macedonia's respective unilateral declarations on the Macedonian language, end of quote. Therefore, the European Union, in fact, didn't accept a clear formulation on language and essentially failed to recognize the Macedonian language as such. At this point, we need to remind you that the Macedonian language was recognized by the UN in 1977. With respect to the Macedonian position on the matter of the language that was supposed to be closed in 1977, the European Union formulation was entirely unacceptable, since it represented a reopening, or rather creation, of a new European Union-sponsored dispute, in quotation dispute, on the closed matter. In this unilateral declaration attached to the French proposal, Bulgarian government openly stated that the Bulgarian side would never never recognized the Macedonian language as an independent, thus intentionally creating a new dispute on language, now recognized as such in the framework of the European Union, that needs to be resolved, says the professor. Similarly, the Bulgarians accomplished to create, or they were successful in creating a so-called dispute on history and identity in general that appears to become a legitimate issue in the European Union and the new conditions for European membership. How so? How can this be so? In conclusion, the French proposal, combined with the mentioned protocol as it part and both unilateral declarations, created an artificial and illegal dispute on cultural national identity, accepted as a legitimate dispute in the EU, which has to be resolved in the path towards membership. Once again, Bulgarian government openly demanded that the Macedonians must declare themselves as Bulgarians, otherwise they wouldn't let this country to obtain a membership in the negotiations with the EU. Ultimatums, bribes, ultimatums. They're supposed to be a democratic country and members of the European Union, which are, its membership is countries that are allegedly democratic, so they claim. Apparently, the European Union in its policy didn't take into consideration that sovereign national rights embedded in the Charter of the United Nations must be respected. These sovereign rights and freedoms contain also cultural sovereignty and sovereign equality that seems to be unknown or completely rejected or neglected, I should say, by the European Union policymakers that couldn't understand that a nation may not be a subject of foreign or imposed forceful assimilation. Remarkably, from the previous discussion, it appears that the Western international community tend to reshape fundamental principle of sovereignty in the world arena, a principle that is the main pillar of international law. More generally, Western powers, or the so-called international community, in a number of small or weak countries, such as those in the Western Balkans, systematically and intentionally ignored, neglected, and negated that fundamental pillar principle of international law. As was seen in the case of the Macedonian identity, cultural independence became a joke after implicitly proclaiming that sovereignty was less important for Macedonian or the Macedonians, and after demonstrated tolerance by EU for the open and imposed forceful assimilation against national identity of Macedonians conducted by the Bulgarian government. It appears that the so-called, in quotes, international community, end of quote, that represent a synonym for Western community of developed, so-called developed countries, headed by the United States of America and the European Union, established a new political doctrine of ignorance for the principle of sovereignty in general. All efforts of the so-called international community aim to diminish the value of that fundamental principle of international law, actually endorsed emerging of a new rules and a political principle of being legitimate to intervene in domestic affairs of all countries in the world for different suitable reasons. In the case of Macedonia, as we demonstrated throughout this publication thus far, after the Prespa agreement, this country is stripped from the basic sovereignty as an element of statehood, is not anymore the same international subject. The newly created republic, so-called the Republic of North Macedonia, after the Prespa agreement, is less than the state in proper legal terms. And so we end 5.1, that is 5.1, chapter 5.1 of the Prespa agreement as a cultural genocide of the Macedonian national identity towards the termination of an illegal treaty by Professor Dr. Igor Janev. Thank you for listening to In Focus with Silvana Pavlovska. I'm looking forward to seeing you shortly again.